Ignoring all survival rules, a man alone in Alaska led a freezing mother bear and her cubs onto his porch. No one expected what happened next. The thermometer showed minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit and was still dropping, the icy wind cutting through the air like a knife. In 5 years, Ethan had never felt such extreme cold. This wasn't just a storm, it was a battle to survive. Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, 4 hours away from the nearest town, stood a lonely wooden cabin, the home of a former wildlife photographer who had left his career in Portland for a secluded life. On that freezing day, listening to the wind howling through the pine trees, Ethan truly wondered for the first time if his decision to live here had been a terrible mistake. The February morning started like any other. Ethan woke up to the familiar crackling of wood in the fireplace, the heat from the dying embers barely reaching the corners of his small living room. Through frost-covered windows, he could see that fresh snow had fallen overnight, adding another layer to the already deep drifts. At 40 years old, Ethan had developed a strict daily routine that helped him survive in these harsh conditions. Every morning he checked the weather radio, took stock of his supplies, and made sure his equipment was in good shape. The walls of his cabin were covered with photographs he had taken over the years. Images of wolves, moose, and bears in their natural habitat were his silent companions in solitude. His pictures had once been published in the biggest wildlife magazines, but after his wife's death 3 years ago, Ethan left everything behind to start a new life far from civilization. That morning's weather forecast made him especially uneasy. A storm was coming from the north, bringing winds strong enough to knock down trees, and a cold that could break records. Ethan knew that in such conditions he could be trapped inside for days, maybe even weeks. He spent the whole day making sure the generator was safe and checking his backup heating. In Alaska, even a small mistake could be fatal. His father's old saying echoed in his head, "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son." Those words had saved him more times than he could remember. By evening, the first wave of the storm hit the cabin with relentless force. Snow felt like a solid white wall, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few steps from the porch. Ethan threw more logs into the fireplace and started his usual storm preparations. His satellite phone, the only reliable connection to the outside world, was fully charged and lay on the table next to his emergency radio. The nearest ranger station was 50 kilometers away, and in this weather, help would be impossible for days if something went wrong. Night fell, and the storm roared, wind whistling through every crack in the cabin. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Suddenly, through the howling wind, a sound reached Ethan's ears, making him jump from his chair. A deep, guttural noise, barely audible through the storm, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years photographing wildlife. A bear, and very close to the cabin. In February, bears should be in deep hibernation. The fact that one was awake and active in these conditions meant something was terribly wrong. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and carefully moved toward the window. The beam of light barely cut through the thick snow, and visibility was still poor. The thermometer now read minus 50 degrees, and the wind chill made it even worse. Then he spotted them. 3 dark figures emerging from the white haze. A mother bear and her 2 cubs, struggling through the deep snow. Even from inside the cabin, Ethan could tell they were fighting for their lives. The mother's usual strong gait had turned into a slow, exhausted shuffle, and the cubs pressed against her, struggling against the biting wind. Years of observing wildlife had taught Ethan to read animal behavior, and what he saw deeply disturbed him. The mother bear was desperate. Only extreme circumstances would force a mother to bring her cubs out in such deadly cold. Something must have disturbed their den, forcing them into this life-threatening storm. The bears reached the cabin, seeking shelter from the merciless wind. In the flashlight's beam, Ethan saw that their fur was covered in a thick layer of ice. The cubs were shivering violently, their small bodies not built for such extreme cold. The mother bear's steps grew weaker. She was losing strength fast. Ethan's heart raced as the bears approached his porch. This was the kind of danger every survival guide warned about. Bears near human buildings were dangerous under normal circumstances, but this situation was far from normal. A desperate mother bear would do anything to protect her cubs. Now Ethan could clearly see the bears through the window. The cubs were much smaller than they should have been. likely born late in the season. Their chances of surviving the night were almost zero. The mother bear began digging at the snow near the porch, trying to make some kind of shelter. But the wind destroyed her efforts in seconds. The temperature plunged, so cold the thermometer froze. The mother bear struggled to shield her cubs. One of the cubs stumbled and sank into the deep snow. The mother carefully lifted it, but the cubs' movements were growing slower. The cubs had been fighting to stay alive for almost an hour, and their condition was getting worse. The second cub collapsed, and this time it took much longer to get back up. The mother bear's attempts to help them were becoming weaker. Her own strength was fading. She let out a low moan, a sound full of despair that cut through the howling wind and sent a chill deep into Ethan's soul. The bears huddled against his porch, desperate for shelter from the wind. The cubs barely moved, and the mother's eyes looked glassy from the cold. In the beam of his flashlight, Ethan saw their shivering slow down, a dangerous sign of hypothermia. Ethan gripped the door handle. Every survival rule screamed, "Stay inside." But could he watch them freeze to death? Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. The cubs had almost stopped moving. The mother bear was desperately trying to cover them from the cold and wind with her body. Her eyes met Ethan's through the window, and in that moment, he saw something that shook him to his core. There was no aggression in her gaze, only exhaustion, desperation, and something eerily close to surrender. Attached to his cabin was a storage room where he kept his photography equipment. It was well insulated, separate from the main living space, and had its own entrance. It could serve as a temporary shelter, but bringing 3 freezing bears inside was madness. The risk was enormous. A panicked bear could destroy the cabin, leaving Ethan stranded in the storm with no protection. The cubs had stopped moving completely. Only the faint rise and fall of their chests showed they were still alive. The mother bear's eyes began to close, and her heavy body sank into the snow. In a few more minutes, it would be too late. Ethan turned on all the heaters in the storage room, warming it as much as possible. He placed blankets near the door, ready to help. The mother bear watched his every move through the window, her gaze following each step he took. In that moment, Ethan no longer saw a dangerous predator. He saw a mother fighting with everything she had left to save her children. The wind howled louder, and the temperature kept dropping mercilessly. The clock showed 2 a.m., the coldest, darkest hour of the night. Ethan took one last deep breath and turned the door handle. The door creaked open, the sound deafening in the frozen night. The wind rushed in, carrying snow and biting cold into the cabin. The bears were only a few steps away, their bodies half buried in the growing snowdrifts. Moving slowly, deliberately cautious, Ethan stepped onto the porch. The mother bear's eyes gleamed as she registered his presence, but she made no aggressive move. It seemed her survival instincts were battling her exhaustion. She lifted her head slightly, her nostrils flaring as she caught his scent. Speaking in a quiet, calm voice, Ethan began clearing a path from the porch to the storage room door. Every movement was slow and non-threatening. "It's okay," he whispered, even though he knew the bears couldn't understand. The mother bear looked at him but didn't act aggressively. The cubs lay still, their small bodies nearly buried in snow. Time was running out. In this freezing cold, even a few minutes outside was risky for Ethan. He had to act now or give up on the idea completely. With trembling hands, he threw the storage room door wide open. Warm air spilled into the freezing night, instantly creating a mist. The mother bear lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as she smelled the heat. It was the strongest movement she had made in the past hour. Ethan's heart pounded as he dared to step closer to the bears, holding blankets in his hands. The mother bear followed his movements, but her protective instincts seemed dulled by the cold and exhaustion. When he was just a few meters away from the cubs, he carefully draped a blanket over them. The mother bear tensed for a moment, and Ethan held his breath, knowing that his life depended on her next reaction. But instead of attacking, she slowly began sniffing the blanket wrapped around her cubs, as if she understood its purpose. Ethan spread another blanket closer to the storage room door, creating a warm path. His fingers were going numb, and he realized he couldn't stay outside much longer. Everything now depended on the mother bear's next move. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled from weakness. The cubs remained motionless under the blanket. The mother bear gently nudged one of her cubs, but it didn't move. A sorrowful moan escaped her, a mother's fear cutting through the howling wind. Ethan slowly backed toward the storage room door. The warm air spilling from inside was an irresistible promise of life in the freezing cold. The huge creature gathered its last bit of strength. With great effort, the mother bear managed to rise, every movement visibly painful. For a moment she stood, swaying in the wind, her gaze shifting from her cubs to the open door. Then, with infinite tenderness, she gripped the blanket in her teeth and began pulling her cubs toward the door. The blanket helped them slide over the snow, but each step drained her precious energy. Her powerful muscles trembled with effort, but her motherly instinct pushed her forward. The distance was only a few steps, but it felt like miles. Ethan stood perfectly still, barely daring to breathe as the bear family slowly made their way towards safety. Finally, they reached the doorway. At the entrance, the mother bear paused. Her massive figure filled the doorway, steam rising from her fur as the warmth of the room met the freezing air. This was the most dangerous moment. If she panicked now in such a small space, there would be no escape. But the overwhelming cold and her desperate need to save her cubs overcame her natural fear. Using the last of her strength, she pulled her cubs over the threshold into the warm room. Ethan watched as the massive bear collapsed beside her cubs, wrapping her body around them as warmth slowly returned. Carefully, he closed the storage room door. Through the small window, he saw the bears huddled together, clinging to the life-saving heat. The mother bear's eyes remained open, watching him, but as the warmth seeped through her frozen fur, the tension in her body began to fade. For the next several hours, Ethan stayed awake, watching through the window that connected his living space to the storage room. The storm outside reached its peak, shaking the cabin walls, but inside, something incredible was happening. The cubs were the first to show signs of life. As their little bodies warmed, they began to move. At first, their movements were weak and barely noticeable, but slowly, they grew stronger. The mother bear sniffed each cub as if bringing them back to life. By sunrise, the cubs were awake and moving, their natural curiosity returning. They stayed close to their mother, but with each hour, their movements became more playful. The storm raged for 2 more days. During that time, Ethan carefully placed water and food near the storage room door while the bears rested. The mother bear accepted his help, her initial wariness giving way to cautious trust. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally ended. Outside, the world had turned into a sparkling landscape of snow and ice, but the temperature was starting to rise. For the first time in days, the sun peeked through the clouds. Ethan knew the time had come. The bears needed to return to the wild. As if sensing this, the mother bear became more restless, her instincts calling her back to the forest. With the same careful movements he had used on that desperate night, Ethan opened the outer door of the storage room. Fresh air and sunlight flooded in, and the mother bear lifted her head, sensing the change. She got to her feet, once again strong and magnificent, nothing like the desperate creature she had been 3 nights ago. At the doorway, she paused. She turned her head toward Ethan, who stood at a respectful distance. Their eyes met one last time, and in that moment there was a strange understanding between them. Then, with surprising grace, she led her cubs out into the snow. Ethan watched as they moved toward the forest, their dark shapes growing smaller against the vast white landscape. Before vanishing into the trees, the mother bear paused and looked back one last time. Then she turned and disappeared into the wilderness with her cubs, leaving only a trail of paw prints in the snow. 6 months later, on a warm August day, Ethan was driving back to his cabin after a rare trip to town for supplies. His old pickup truck rumbled along the winding mountain road. After the harsh winter, the past few months had been filled with frequent photography sessions, capturing nature awakening once more. As he rounded a bend, a massive bear suddenly stepped onto the road. Ethan slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded and came to a stop just inches from a large tree. Gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled fingers, Ethan stared at the enormous creature blocking the road. The bear stood motionless, looking straight at him. Something about the bear's stance seemed familiar. Could it really be her? No, that was impossible. But the longer he looked, the more convinced he became. It was the same mother bear he had saved during the winter. Then a strange rumbling filled the air. Ethan felt the ground beneath his truck begin to tremble. A sudden crash made Ethan jump. Just a few dozen meters ahead, a massive chunk of rock broke away from the overhanging cliff and crashed onto the road with a thunderous impact. If not for the bear's sudden appearance, Ethan would have been caught right in the middle of it. The mother bear had deliberately stopped his truck, saving him from certain death. Ethan turned around and took the longer route home. This was a moment to remember, not just in a photo, but deep in his soul. Did you enjoy this story? Do you believe animals can remember those who have helped them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Sometimes acts of kindness with no expectations lead to the most wonderful surprises. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Have an amazing day.